Exploring the culture, the adventure, and the impact of martial arts. That's what we do at Kung Fu Podcast. I'm your host, Sifu T.W. Smith. Welcome to episode 45. And if this is your first time, that's exactly what we do here. We explore the culture, the adventure, and the impact of martial arts. And this is my effort to support authentically and transparently the beauty, the power, and the effect that martial arts has had and has in our lives. Your martial arts interest can power many parts of your life if you allow it. So I always encourage you to go out to practice every day. Whatever style you do, and no matter if you're practicing for combat, health, show, civilian defense, or to have a lifestyle that has a structure and a direction, it's important to go out and go practice. People I mention at Kung Fu Podcast is because we've built a relationship, not because I was paid. If I do have an affiliation with anyone, you can be rest assured that it is because I have built a relationship with them first. Let's recognize some of the connections that were made this past week. The Martial Arts Museum, those folks are out in California, and it's really cool because they have all these items and people from the past, articles of information and history that we're going to look at how those can be tied into Kung Fu Podcast, the stories, legends, perhaps even just places or faces that are associated with them. Chris Faye's Okinawan Karate School got a hold of us. Glenn Ray David, who works with the Navy over on Twitter. Mr. Mike Salatalo. And Mike, if you're listening, I hope I didn't butcher your name. It was really cool. I went over your Twitter page, and you got the Bruce Lee and Ip Man cover on the page, and that just happens to be the main topic for today's podcast. Elizabeth Maria Perez Castillo over on Facebook. Thank you for getting a hold of us there. And if you all know, I'm still trying to learn how to do Facebook. Not a professional at it, but I'm learning. Miss Lisa Park from episode 36 had sent me an email the other day. Lisa's the one that does the meditational work with the EEG and puts it on display out with a beautiful presentation with water bowls and things along those lines. Her email said, I just had an opening last Friday for Synesthetic, presenting the experimental work in optical sound and neurofeedback technology at the Reverse Gallery in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, New York. I plan to come visit the space about once a week to meet with visitors and chat with participants. So the link will be in the show notes and on the website if you're ever out there or if you just want to see further about what Lisa's up to now. Those of you that supports the programming by being a content member, your new streaming audio area and Strategies and Tactics Against Multiple Assailants ebook are both ready for you over the White Bamboo store. The other day I received an email from Mr. Nick Wright. Now, Mr. Wright is a teacher of the Cholefoot Academy in Vista, California. Nick, I told you I'd send a shout out, and I wanted to let you know that I appreciate you getting a hold of me over there on Facebook and Instagram. And I went over to Mr. Wright's Cholefoot website, and I got to admit, I always have a slight lean toward Cholefoot because it was one of the first combat martial arts that we were taught and learned, my classmates and I, and we had to openly spar against one another, remembering that, the guys who I learned with, it was all for combat, because they were taking it out into the field. Cholefoot is an excellent art for developing combat skills. Nick wrote, quote, I've been listening to both your podcasts for some time now, and they've been extremely educational. I enjoy them both very much. I also follow Ben Judkins over at Kung Fu Tea and love the collaboration between the both of you. I would enjoy sharing some of the Cholefoot history with you and help promote traditional Kung Fu as much as possible. End quote. Thank you, Nick, for taking your time and sharing that information with me and also sending me the email. And by the way, I like that wood dummy you have on your contact page, so I'm asking you outright, did you make that? And speaking of wood dummies, which provides me a segue to the main topic for the day, but before I do, let me have a friend introduce the show.
Hi, this is Andrea Harkins at themartialartswoman.com. You are exploring the culture, adventure, and impact of martial arts with Sifu T.W. Smith.
Thank you, Andrea. I want to take a moment and recognize Ben Judkins, who's over at Kung Fu Tea. You all hear me talk about him quite a bit. His new book is coming out in August 2015. It's called The Creation of Wing Chun. Check the website for the show notes. The publisher, SUNY Press, wrote the description as follows. The Creation of Wing Chun, a social history of Southern Chinese martial arts. And it says, quote, this book explores the social history of Southern Chinese martial arts and their contemporary importance to the local identity and narratives of resistance. Hong Kong's Bruce Lee ushered the Chinese martial arts onto an international stage in the 1970s. Lee's teacher, Ip Man, master of Wing Chun Kung Fu, has recently emerged as a highly visible symbol of Southern Chinese identity and pride. Benjamin N. Junkins and John Nielsen examine the emergence of Wing Chun to reveal how this body of social practices developed and why individuals continue to turn to the martial arts as they navigate the challenges of a rapidly evolving environment. After surviving the development of hand combat traditions in Guangdong Province from roughly the start of the 19th century until 1949, the authors turned to Wing Chun, noting its development, the changing social attitudes towards this practice over time, and its ultimate emergence as a global art form. So today we're going to take a couple of Ben's posts, blend them together, and we're going to be looking at Wing Chun, Ip Man, Bruce Lee, and the Mook Jong, or the wooden pole as we call it around here. The title of one of Ben's articles is The Brief History of the Wooden Dummy in the Southern Chinese Martial Arts. Wing Chun is arguably the Chinese martial arts style most associated with the wooden dummy. Now, when I began to first learn Kung Fu, we used to use the wooden pole, and we used Choli foot techniques to hit it. Then Hop Gar, and then later we would use it to train Xing Yi, Yi Tuan, Bakwa, Tai Chi Chuan, plus wire whips, bags, beans, and water buckets, the whole 9 yards. But then the Moki Pai, or the wooden ear blocks, was introduced, particularly with the Choli foot and the Hop Gar. Ben states that the wooden pole is used throughout the Southern Chinese martial arts. Southern Mantis and Hung Gar boxers occasionally use the dummy, as do Choli foot practitioners. In fact, Choli foot employs a great variety of somewhat more mechanical, complex training tools with their training. But the dummy is not restricted to just martial arts. Wooden training devices have been used by the military forces from ancient time. Sima Qian, 145 to 86 BC, was a Chinese historian of the Han Dynasty. He is considered the father of Chinese historiography for his work, The Records of the Grand Historian, which is a series of biographies to share the general history of China. This covered more than 2,000 years from the Yellow Emperor to his time, during the reign of the Emperor Wu of Han. Many later generations referred to him as the Grand Historian for his monumental work. A work in later generations would often be only somewhat tactically or glancingly acknowledged as an achievement only made possible by his acceptance and endurance of punitive actions against him, which included being imprisoned, castrated, and subjected to servility. Sima Qian is also the first individual to discuss the wooden dummy. In Records of the Grand Historian, written between the 2nd and 1st centuries BC, he mentions that Emperor Wu Yi of the Shang Dynasty made the word O-Ren, a wooden human figure that could be used for Xiao Bo, bare hand fighting practice. So there you go. 1st century BC, Sima Qian was the first one to ever write about using the wooden devices, at least in the Chinese history. Ben writes that some scholars debate how much weight to put on Sima Qian's early histories, but there's no doubt that the tradition of using wooden devices for combat training goes back a very, very, very long time. But also it was not just restricted to the military. In more recent centuries, wooden dummies became a feature of Southern Chinese popular culture. Stories of the Southern Shaolin Temple included its hall of diabolical mechanical dummies that a student had to defeat in order to graduate and leave the temple. Much of this lore was conveyed through popular novels, stories, street performances, and, of course, the opera. The Cantonese opera troupes attracted large crowds with feats of martial prowess and military plays. This made it essential that they have tools for training the martial artists. Wooden dummies, very similar to the sort still used today, helped to train the performers. The Cantonese Opera Museum in Foshan even displays an antique dummy along with other artifacts of the industry's 19th century. Ben notes that he has always found it interesting that in translating their signage, the museum refers to these training devices as instruments rather than dummies. Obviously, there are a lot of percussion instruments in traditional opera, and wooden dummies do make a very distinctive set of sounds when they're struck. Ben says that in their teaching and practice of Wing Chun, they count a movement of the dummy form as being completed when the dummy makes a distinct sound, rather than when a martial artist moves a limb to a certain place. So with that being said, it's not that much of a stretch of the imagination about why they call it an instrument rather than a wooden dummy. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of examples of the really old dummies anymore. These objects were made of wood, and when they were planted into the ground, they would eventually rot. This had to be an issue in the climate as humid and wet as southern China. Wooden dummies likely started to disappear from the local landscape around the 1900s. Opera was being displaced by other forms of entertainment, and the martial arts was decidedly unpopular in the years following the Boxer Rebellion. If you need to know more about that, go to episode 43, where the Marines battled the Boxer Rebellion, and episode 44, Transformational Events that Changed the Chinese Martial Arts. Fortunately, events like that have a habit of reversing themselves. So by the 1920s, there was an increased popular interest in the martial arts. Part of this was the result of the effort reforms made by the Jingwu Association to promote the traditional hand combat styles as a distinct form of unique Chinese physical culture. However, the growth of the economy and the transformation of the traditional teaching structures into the market-based public schools also helped the martial arts gain a new following in the middle class and urban areas, where they had been traditionally not received very well. As the southern Chinese martial arts grew, more wooden dummies were produced and put into place. And Ben has a good picture here of a wooden dummy buried outside the Foshan Jingwu Association, outside of a brick wall into what appears to be a sidewalk of concrete. Most of the wooden dummies were a type of what are now called daizhong, or ground dummies, sometimes referred to as a buried or dead dummy. They were constructed from a log or a tree trunk that was anywhere from 8 to 10 feet long. Generally speaking, the lower 3.5 feet would be worked into a thick square and buried into a stone or cement, just like the one in the picture. The round main body of the dummy would sit about 3 inches above the ground, and this was just enough room to allow shredded rattan strips to be slipped into the spaces between the square base of the dummy and the side of the pit. Packing that area in this way supported the central pole in an upright position, but it also allowed for a little give and spring when the dummy was being struck or pushed. Daizhongs, or wooden dummies buried in the concrete, are still commonly seen in a number of places. They're encountered in Guangdong province and appear to be fairly common in Vietnam as well, where at least some of them have been given a more exaggerated swinging motion. Given the construction of the traditional one-story home in southern China, they could be either planted indoors or outdoors in the training areas. So let's bring the Wing Chun and the wooden dummy together. Wing Chun is normally a polarizing topic of conversation, and Ben writes that those within the Wing Chun community are passionate for their art and are generally ready to hold forth with a long exposition on the brilliance of their system. Of course, all martial artists are dedicated to their style. It takes a lot of devotion to do anything for decades. There are a handful of styles like Wing Chun, MMA, Tai Chi Chuan that seem to encourage such a high degree of enthusiasm that they become a virtual worldview. Now, this tendency is not always appreciated by the broader martial arts community. Wing Chun is in a particular delicate situation. While Tai Chi may have numbers of folks, cultural prestige, and the weight of history on its side, Wing Chun is a relatively new art, practically unknown until the 1960s, and much more likely to be practiced by individuals outside of mainland China, and even Hong Kong, than within it. This sudden success and lack of real Chinese history has caused a certain degree of resentment. For instance, the important early American student of the Chinese martial arts, R.W. Smith, he never liked Wing Chun, and he firmly believed that all of the Chinese martial arts of Guangdong were rubbish. Bruce Lee irritated him to no end, and he never hesitated to give his opinion on these subjects. Now, Ben has a series of pictures on his post that shows folks working out on a wooden pole planted out in the study. It's a very good example of the sort of indoor dummy that Donnie Yen was working on in the first Ip Man movie. Master Kwok Fu, one of Ip Man's original Foshan students, planted his dummy outdoors sometime after the Cultural Revolution, presumably, and it was still teaching students on it into the 1990s. Now, this is also the same sort of dummy that Ip Man would have learned the form on. Interestingly, all of the early wooden dummies seem to have a relatively thick offset of arms, rather than the parallel arms that are more commonly associated with the Ip Man lineage today, and had smaller legs. However, they seem to have a roughly same proportions as the modern dummies. In both cases, the top arm of the wooden dummy sits about the level of the practitioner's shoulder. Now in Ben's post, the next session is called Ip Man Invents the Modern Wing Chun Wooden Dummy. Now while Ip Man probably owned a dummy in Foshan, the story doesn't really get interesting until we reach about the 1950s. In 1949, Ip Man and a daughter fled to Macau and then Hong Kong in anticipation of the communist conquest of Guangdong. After a number of years of anti-communist campaigns sponsored by the China's National People's Party, it was probably no longer safe for Ip Man to stay there, given his prior employment as a leader of the local police unit. Then due to the unexpected closure of the border, Ip Man found himself living alone, without his immediate family or any means of economic support. And exactly the time in his life when most people are thinking about retiring and taking some time to get himself collected, he talks some things over with his friends, and he decides to formally take up the mantle of Sifu and to open up his own Wing Chun school. There were a number of complications, and the first one was that he did not have a wooden dummy. More to the point, he had yet to establish a local reputation, have a pool of stable students, or a location for a permanent school. Ip Man would spend the first few years of his teaching career addressing each of these problems. Yet by the middle of the 1950s, things were starting to look up. Ip Man was building a large group of more advanced students, and it was now time to consider installing a dummy so that their training could progress. Ip Man was already showing some of his students sections of the wooden dummy form that they were practicing like any other set, and in Wing Chun parlance, this is called using the air dummy. While good for a quick review, it's no substitute for the geometric discipline of the real thing. Life in Hong Kong was very different from Foshan. To begin with, people tended to live in tall apartment buildings rather than the one-story dwellings with the flagstone floors. And outdoor space in Hong Kong is extremely limited, just as it is today. Now, the best source of information on the development of modern dummies within the Wing Chun clan during the Hong Kong era is in the book Ip Man's Wing Chun, Mu Kyung Jong Sam Fat. And the book there, the link will be on the website in the show notes. Now, it can be a difficult book to get a hold of, but it's been a big help in assembling the following account. Sometime in the mid-1950s, Ip Man approached a carpenter and a friend named Feng Shek. Ip Man explained his basic problem, and he talked about what he wanted in a dummy. Then he commissioned Feng Shek to devise some means for constructing a mounting system for an indoor portable dummy because Ip Man moved frequently during this period. The artwork for this show is the first wooden dummy owned by Ip Man that's at display at the Ip Man Museum in Foshan. There are a number of ways to mount a wooden dummy, but Feng Shek's idea was both simple and innovative. Rather than supporting the dummy at its base, the traditional method by burying it, he instead hung the pole on wooden slats that passed directly through the wooden body. The thin slats acted as springs. By moving the supporting structure up the body, where most of the form was actually being performed, the feel of the dummy was substantially changed. Most Daijongs had a limiting rocking motion if they moved at all. The new Guazhong, the one on the wooden slats, was called a live dummy, and it felt different. It all had to do with the placement and the strength of the slats. When a student engaged the arms or legs of the wooden dummy, they were in effect loading a spring which would throw the dummy back at them in a more of a lifelike way the moment the pressure was released. In effect, a Guazhong, a live dummy, offers a degree of feedback on your movements that you simply could not get from a buried dummy. Given that this instrument is often used as a sort of silent training partner, every ounce of feedback that you could squeeze out of it is very valuable. So for instance, in the Wing Chun system, the students want to punch toward the opponent's center line. If you do that with the wooden dummy from practically any forward-facing angle, you will force the body back onto the wooden slats, and then the recoil will return the dummy to its initial position. But if your lines of attack are off, and you're punching across the front of the dummy or simply pushing at the arms, the body will slide along the rails, retreating from your incomplete strike. This is critical because it provides instant feedback to the students on the sort of subtle pressures that can be felt and understood. Together, Ip Man and Feng Shek fine-tuned the new creation. The basic idea was sound, but it took a bit of experimentation to work out exactly what sort of slats and mounting system yielded the best results. The final product was a truly custom and innovative dummy for the young Hong Kong Wing Chun clan. Fung Shek delivered his prototype to Ip Man in 1956. And while Ip Man worked with a number of different dummies over the years as he moved from one school to the next, he always kept the first Fung Shek creation with him. It was his preferred dummy to set up in a school, and eventually in his own home. In fact, this is the same dummy that is used now in the famous series of photographs taken by Tong Song in 1967. It was always his personal wooden dummy. It can now be seen on display again over the Ip Man Museum in Foshan. I'll put a link to a video clip of the Ip Man Museum in the show notes for you. Some of Ip Man's more senior students were starting to branch off and open their own schools in the second half of the 1950s. Fung Shek, with his new indoor mounting system, was the sole source for dummies in this early period. Unfortunately, there are not many examples left of his work. Fung Shek never actually produced that many wooden zhongs. Ip Jing estimates that Fung Shek only produced about 10 to 12 dummies between the late 1950s and the early 1960s when he stopped taking orders. One possible example of Fung Shek's work might be the well-known photograph of Bruce Lee around 1960, where he was working at Ruby Chow's restaurant and practiced Wing Chun in his spare time. In a letter to Hawkins Chung, dated May 1960, Bruce Lee mentions that he is having a wooden dummy shipped to him. He had to place that order in around 1959. The Bruce Lee photo is interesting, and it's a clear example of the new Guanchang type. In the picture, you also note that the dummy is not mounted at the correct height. Now, that could be probably because Bruce's material circumstances were far from ideal at that point, and he really didn't have much control of his physical environment at that time. Apart from that, the dummy looks remarkably similar to Ip Man's. If the picture with Bruce Lee and the wooden dummy was Fung Shek's, it would have been his last, because the carpenter's son was killed in a car accident, and Fung Shek interpreted this tragedy as retribution by the local gods for his involvement with the Wing Chun clan. At that time, many of the younger members of Ip Man School in the middle of the 1950s were basically angry young men who were frequently involved in neighborhood fights. In this context, Fung Shek came to see his own creation as a device that was being used to aid bullies and in better intimidating and hurting others. So Fung Shek vowed to never make another one, and he stuck to that pledge. While Ip Man had the dummy he needed, others were not so fortunate. The Wing Chun clan was expanding rapidly in the early 1960s, and Fung Shek's retirement could not have come at a worse time. From 1958 to 1962, Ip Man taught at the Shek Kep Mai School, and for some reason, either a lack of advanced students or a lack of space, Ip Man was never able to set up his dummy. In 1962, he moved his school to its Castle Peak Road location, and the dummy was brought out of storage and reinstalled by Ip Ching, that's his son, who had recently reunited with his father. Unfortunately, this location did not last long, so in 1963, Ip Man was looking for a new piece of school property. Luckily, he ran into an old friend from Foshan named Ho Lun. Ho Lun had always wanted to study Wing Chun, but never had the chance. In 1963, Ho Lun owned the Tai Sung restaurant, which had mostly an empty warehouse space above it. He offered that space to Ip Man, who accepted it as a new location for his school. Unexpectedly, Fung Shek's dummy had to go back into storage, though. It seems that Ho Lun was mechanically minded and something of a handyman, so he had been thinking about his own wooden dummy designs, and when Ip Man arrived, he found one already installed. Ho Lun wanted to add additional degrees of realism to the dummy, so he included an element of mechanical movement. It was designed so the arms could move in and out as well. After a period of experimentation, it was determined that it was difficult for Wing Chun students to practice their sticky energy with it. So Ho Lun went back to a more conventional all-wood dummy, but he continued to experiment with the mounting system. Where Fung Shek had used wooden slats as springs, Ho Lun favored metal car springs. These could actually be attached to the wall and adjusted so that they would provide exactly the right amount of resistance. He later took his designs and went into production. He made wooden dummies for the Wing Chun community from 1969 through 1973 before immigrating to Canada. Ip Man never seemed to settle in one place for long, and in 1964, about a year and a half of being in the restaurant, he moved into a small apartment on Tung Choi Street. The Fung Shek wooden dummy was once again taken out of storage and it was installed by the front door where it was used by both him and his son Ip Ching. This is where Ku Song was able to study the Mukjang in some detail. Ku Song was an important individual in the history of the modern Wing Chun clan. While a few people had made a small number of dummies, it was never enough to cover the growing demand. Further, it is simply impossible to teach the Wing Chun system without access to a dummy. Ku Song took very careful measurements of Feng Shek's original Zhong, and he replicated these in his own work. While Feng Shek and Ho Lung had relatively short manufacturing careers, Ku Song proved to be both much more successful and stable. Compared to his predecessors, he produced a large number of dummies over a period of decades, and in fact, he didn't retire from the Wing Chun dummy business until the 1990s. Not only did he make a lot of wooden dummies, Ku Song made them very, very well. In fact, in some Wing Chun circles today, Ku Song wooden dummies are still the standard by which all the others are judged. So there we go, a history and a long history of the wooden dummy, where it started off in the 1st century BC. It got all the way through, got mostly associated with Wing Chun, Ip Man and his first wooden dummy, and how that all got all the way out to the movies and into a museum, and Bruce Lee and his intersections with it as well. Many styles of martial arts use wooden dummies as a way to get that feedback, like Ben was saying, and you do. You listen to the sounds, you pay attention to how it's struck, you pay attention to how it's moved. When you have a moment, check the link for Ben's book, The Creation of Wing Chun, A Social History of Southern Chinese Martial Arts. If you'd like to support the program, you can go over to iTunes or Stitcher, wherever you subscribe, leave a review. I read everything. Send me an email, kungfupodcast.com/contact. Thank you for joining me in episode 45, looking at the impact of the wooden dummy, Ip Man, Bruce Lee, and Wing Chun Kung Fu. Have a great week. Get out there to practice. This is Sifu T.W. Smith, and I'll talk with you again very soon.